cranial bones: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and the external occipital protuberance. The inion is the most prominent projection of the protuberance. It is used as a landmark for the 10 to 20 lead recording EEG. The temporal mandibular joint is here. The mastoid process is here. The styloid process is here. And the external acoustic meatus is here. The squamous part is here, which I drew in because my skeleton didn't have it. The internal view, I don't know if you can see that. The petrous part of the temporal bone is here. And within it is housed the components of the inner ear. The internal acoustic meatus, which is right here, houses the vestibulocochlear nerve, the facial nerve, and the labyrinth artery. The sphenoid is here. It is lateral and orbital parts of the greater wing. There, it's behind the eyes. The superior orbital fissure is right here. The lacrimal and frontal divisions of the ophthalmic nerve, trochlear nerve, superior division of the oculomotor nerve, abducens nerve, and nasociliary branch of the ophthalmic nerve. The internal view, the lesser wing and the greater wing. The optic canal is right here. If you can see these two holes right here. The sella turcica holds the pituitary gland, and it is right here. For the ethmoid, the crista galli is this bone right here. I've kind of drew it in to make it more visible. And this is a median ridge of bone that projects from the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. It is where the falx cerebri attaches anteriorly to the skull. The cribriform plate, which is right here, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, the accessory nerve. So the cranial nerves 9, 10, 11 pass through the jugular foramen. This creates the pathway. Now onto the sutures. The coronal suture is right here, and it is in between the frontal and the parietal bone. The sagittal goes from the middle of the parietal bone to the front, from frontal to occipital. The lambdoid suture separates the parietal and the occipital nerve, so this is the lambdoid suture. The squamous separates the parietal and the temporal, which I have drawn in. The facial bones, maxilla and the alveolar process. This is the maxilla, and the alveolar process is in the bottom and top. Sorry, I have to put the vomer back. The nasal bone, the zygomatic process. The zygomatic bone is right here. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone form the zygomatic arch. The ethmoid bone is here. The vomer is here. And this is a vertical plate of the vertical plate of the vomer bone articulates with perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone to form the bony nasal septum. The septum separates the nasal cavity into two halves called the nasal fossae. The inferior nasal concha separates the nasal cavity into two bilateral and symmetrical anatomical caves, your nostrils. The mandible is here. This is the body. The angle is the bottom of the mandible. The ramus is this part right here, the cheek of the mandible. The mandibular condyle is the top part of the mandible right here. The mandibular notch is the groove right next to it. And the coronoid process is the part up here. Kind of hard to see, but let me take the mandible out and show you. So this is the mandibular condyle, this is the mandibular notch, and this is the coronoid process. And the joint that holds it all together is a TMJ joint. Now onto the vertebral column. The vertebral column has the cervical curvature from C1 to C7. It is concave and primary. The thoracic curvature is from T1 to T12. It is convex and it is primary. The lumbar curvature from L1 to L5 is concave and it is secondary. And the sacral curvature has 5 fused vertebrae and it is convex and secondary. It forms an S shape. The atlas is C1 and it supports the head and allows the skull to nod. There are 7 vertebrae in the cervical column. Each transverse process contains a transverse foramen through which the vertebral arteries pass service to the brain, and that makes it unique from all the other vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae from 1 to 12 has a spinous process, which is this point right here. It has a transverse process, which is this part right here on the sides. The intervertebral foramen, you can't really see on this model, but the pipe is going through the intervertebral foramen, and that's where the spinal cord passes through. The body of centrum is the part right here that is connected to the vertebrae. The position of the intervertebral discs increase in size from first to last. They are heart-shaped, and as you can see, they point downward. The lumbar vertebrae, they have 5, from 1 to 5. The sacrum has 5 fused vertebrae, and then there is the coccyx, the tailbone. The sternum has the manubrium, the body of the sternum. It has the xiphoid process, and the jugular notch, which is at the top right here, and it's a little indent onto the manubrium. True ribs. There are 7 true ribs, and they are connected at the sternum, which makes it different from the false ribs. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all connected to the sternum. Ribs 8 through 12, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are not connected to the sternum, and they are considered false ribs. The true ribs are called vertebrosternal ribs, and the false ribs are called vertebrochondral ribs. The head of the rib, here, the head inside is the head, and it attaches to the vertebrae, followed by the neck of the rib and the tubercle. The head articulates with the vertebral bodies by 2 facets, which you cannot see on here. The neck is the constricted part of the rib, and just beyond the head, lateral to this, is the knob-like tubercle. And you can't really tell on the skeleton, the tubercle, but if you look right here, it's kind of a knob right there. The knob-like tubercle articulates with the costal facet of the transverse process, which, as we learned, is right here. So it's connected to the transverse process of the vertebrae, the true rib. And it's always paired with the same number of vertebrae. The ribs are always connected to the vertebrae.